with one of the representative of contemporary Swiss music. And to begin with, I have to introduce myself, probably. My name is Sergej Tchirkov. I'm accordionist. Used to work as assistant artistic director of the Studio for New Music Ensemble. And I also been teaching at the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory. I'm currently working as a research fellow at the University of Bergen in Norway. And it's my pleasure to introduce Johannes Knapp, who is artistic director of the Collegium Novum Zürich. And more than that, he's also doing all the administrative work. So he is an intendant. How would you call this in German? So in English, this is a general manager. And we will probably come back to the biography of Johannes a little bit later, because there are a few questions that I wanted Johannes to ask you. But it's not going to be a usual interview tonight, because we are basically not interviewing each other. We are just communicating. Probably we will discuss some interesting thing, probably not. Nobody knows. We don't have a clear structure. We just took the liberty as experts in this project. So we just took the liberty of presenting our view on what's going on in Switzerland and in Russia, and to exchange on the points of collaboration between the two countries, maybe to look at some historical aspects, maybe to propose our opinions on the tendencies that are going to be developed, and things like that. But before we begin, I wanted to thank the whole team of Stravinsky.Online, who invited both of us for this very interesting, exciting, and responsible role of experts. And I want to thank Pro Helvetia, this is a Swiss Arts Council, for supporting this project and for making it all possible. For those of you who occasionally join us for the first time, I suggest to check out the other sessions, the other interviews that were taken by members of Stravinsky.Online, and with different actors of contemporary Swiss music scene. And not only music, there's much more than that. So this was a brief presentation. Johannes, welcome. Hello.
So yeah, thank you so much. I'm happy to see you again after a long time. We couldn't meet due to the pandemic. No, that's not true. We met in a concert, after a concert.
Right.
In which you played pieces by Alfred Zimmerlin in May in Zurich. It was on one of the first concerts after the pandemic. Well, we are not after the pandemic, unfortunately, but one of the first concerts I heard after a long time. Thank you for your kind introduction, and I'm happy to be here now in the virtual space, let's say. Perhaps we could start with a little, looking back to the interviews we already had. Until right now, we had 6 episodes with protagonists that you can listen to on the website Stravinsky.Online. We had a curator and percussionist, Serge Ville, from Geneva. We had a women composer, performer, and visual artist, Charlotte Hug. Then we had percussionist, I would say performer and ensemble founder, Pascal Villino. Then we had Willy Fussen, double bass player and head of the degree program Contemporary Music, Sonic Space at the Hochschule für Musik Basel. A very interesting interview. And then on the 5th position, the composer, and well, it's always difficult to find just some words to describe complex personality, but I would say media artist, Andreas Eduardo Frank. And last but not least, in the 6th episode on the 2nd of September, I think Anja Wernicke, project manager and co-director of Zeiträume Basel, which is the festival in Basel, which is taking place in these days and until the end of next week, I think. And another very interesting personality is invited to talk next week on the evening of the 16th of September, Helena Winkelmann. She's a very versatile personality with wide-ranging, brilliant activities, and she surprises me again and again. Well, just to contextualize our talk today, Sergej, just thought, I was wondering yesterday why this project is called Stravinsky Dialogues. And I had a little look, and well, Stravinsky and his family moved 110 years ago, roundabout, to a village next to Montreux, Clarens, in summer 1910, I think, to take advantage of the region's healthy climate that was beneficial for his wife's health, actually. And today, Montreux is the Mecca of jazz. And more than 100 years ago, the city was a meeting place for musicians of the contemporary music scene of the time. And I think it was not in Paris where Stravinsky met Ravel, Maurice Ravel, but in Montreux. And
yeah, I think it was in Switzerland, right? Because and it was also last not least thanks to Ansermet, who I think was a host to Stravinsky. So because Stravinsky stayed at his house, and just because you mentioned a percussion player and a curator, so you mentioned Sergej today, and I just wanted to say that the ensemble Contrechamp that Sergej is now directing, that the ensemble Contrechamp for many years was based in a concert hall in a studio, which was called Ernest Ansermet studio. Ernest Ansermet. So it's so interconnected, really.
Yeah, and Ansermet was an important figure, and I think at the time director of the Kursaal in Montreux, the concert hall, and it might have been Ansermet who introduced Stravinsky to André Gide, to Jean Cocteau, and also, last but not least, the author of the Histoire du Soldat, the Soldier's Tale, Charles Ferdinand Ramu. It's an emblematic anecdote, let's say, for this intercultural exchange.
Yeah, I think that fits really well into the whole concept of the project, and really, I mean, it's clear that it's organized and inspired by Stravinsky.Online, but that's very true what you have just said, that there's connections with a biography of Stravinsky, who also before he settled in Montreux, he came to this part of the world because that was a quite famous place for those who wanted to do something healthy. But yes, he settled there, as he said, in this house, and it was also a nice place. And right, and I think that's the reason that the project is called Stravinsky's Dialogue, maybe partly. Yeah.
Well, we should not talk too much about the past, about yesterday. Focus on today, but I would nevertheless, I would like to say just in some points something about the past of modern contemporary music in Switzerland. And we have, as we say in German, we have to have a Mut zur Lücke. It is all about the courage to leave gaps. I think you can say that like in English. So this is also what I just said is this also counts as a kind of advance apology to all those who feel unjustly left out of today's conversation. I'm not a musicologist, although I can't get rid of that image because I've written a lot about contemporary music in recent times. However, I would like to describe some very general summarizing impressions that I have of the 20th century music scene in Switzerland. I used to work as the managing director of the Swiss Association of Musicians, Schweizerischer Tonkünstlerverein, an organization with an absolutely impressive and rich history, and which was fusion or merged with other organizations a few years ago in autumn 2017, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I found this confrontation with the history always very interesting. So let's try just in a few points, and perhaps we can find some similarities and differences too between Switzerland and Russia, even though it's difficult to compare these very different countries. Well, you know, to be very honest and very clear about that, I have never understood what it really means when we're talking about Swiss music. Swiss in the sense of character, or in the sense of personality, or is it simply a matter of asking what distinguishes the music that originated here in this country from that which originated elsewhere? And are the creators of Swiss music those who hold a Swiss passport? You see, I mean, this question is not so easy to answer. And especially today, in recent times, it is all about the question of identity. And I find this discourse rather obscure. And I mean, if it were a question of defining certain Swiss characteristics in the world of music, then one would have to be able to prove that the biographical situation of the composers has found or have found its traces in their compositions. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
So, and not only that, one would also have to be able to identify characteristics that the music of composer A has in common with the music of composer B.
Yeah,
and then
right. Okay.
One would have to check whether the composer's biographical situation has left its mark on the compositions. And then one would have to check whether composer C, who has probably nothing to do with Switzerland, but who lives in Russia, does not also show such characteristics.
Probably if we would just follow this logic, we would come to a school of compositions, you know, the big school, which probably do not exist anymore, or at least they do not exist in Switzerland, as far as I know, but which were quite common and in the past, everywhere. And yeah, that's of course that's a very first question when you have a project dedicated to a particular country. So in our case, this is Switzerland. So what does being Swiss mean? So what is Swissness in music? Yeah, but then also speaking about definitions, there can be many more interesting questions. So because also another question that comes into the mind is, what is contemporary music? So what are we talking about? Yeah, and then, but we probably will come to this a bit later, but we also can talk about our approach. So why we, for example, suggested these participants, those protagonists of Swiss music to be contacted and not the others.
Yeah.
So because of course, I think both of us, we agree that every contribution, every artistic movement, every contribution is important, and this is somehow, it works as part of identification of a country in general. So yeah, this is a very good point that you made, this logic as composer, for instance, composer B, and then comes composer C, who might not be necessarily Swiss, or on the contrary, there are composers who are Swiss, or maybe they even hold the Swiss passport, but who somehow moved from Switzerland. And the most famous example, speaking about contemporary music, is probably Beat Furrer, who is a Swiss. I think he's still Swiss citizen, but he works in Austria all his life. And
I think he's Austrian citizen, and I'm not sure if you can have both citizenship.
Well, I think 4 years ago, for sure, he had Swiss citizenship.
Okay.
I don't know. Well, anyway, so but still, he is a Swiss composer, and he considered to be a Swiss composer. And if you are doing a project and you need support for particular composer, so Beat Furrer theoretically can also be considered as one of those.
That's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
Yeah.
Sergej, before we continue, I have to admit something. I have never been in Russia until right now.
Okay.
We should
Yeah,
have
I'm
been in
afraid.
Russia in
Right
May,
now, right.
Collegium Novum
Yeah.
Zürich, but it didn't work, unfortunately, in May 21. What I wanted to say is you are a border crosser as a musician. You have so many activities in Switzerland and in Russia. So you have much broader overview, and you can better compare these two countries than me. I just wanted to say that in order to be transparent about this lack of experience, to put it like this. Something very peculiar about Switzerland is that historically there is a lack of style-defining centers, as for example in Germany, in France, or in Austria, the Kurds.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps one exception in Switzerland is the monastery of St. Gall, which was only important for European church music, quite an important center at a certain time. But how is it in Russia? It's a very naive question. Historically, have there been certain centers of producing music? I just was wondering about that. Could you say something about this?
You mean in 20th century or earlier?
Earlier, the music history in general.
Well, that was basically also vocal music, and there was a strong church tradition. Because generally Russia, with all some specific aspects, it belongs to the Western music tradition. So, for example, if you would talk about Tibetan tradition, that would be something totally different, because there is no priority of human voice as a reflection of divine. That just doesn't exist. But in European music and Western music, and Russia also counts as Western country in sense of music. That's just different. Of course, there were some specific aspects, but I'm not sure that I'm qualified enough really to talk about early Russian music, because there is a lot of research. I know that always has been a lot of research on this, and also now there is a lot of interest. I know even from contemporary composers who are coming back to, so to say, to our roots, because since 80th and 90th century, Russian composers, they were more or less working in the mainstream of European traditions. So then we got the symphony, we got opera. Of course, we had this before, and we even had a Russian Baroque, which is also coming back now. There's a big problem of support, but otherwise, I know that there are people who are really motivated, who are engaged with revisiting those Baroque Russian operas, which also can be really interesting, I know, but it's something that's probably you would never hear of, because they are, you would not compare this to Vivaldi or to German Baroque or to Netherlands. So there's something completely different. But on the other hand, folk music was quite influential in Russia too, as probably as everywhere. At first, it was banned by the church, because you were not supposed to do music outside of church, and and especially instrumental music, because Russian church always prioritized singing over the rest. So, for example, we never had this tradition of installing organs.
Well, this is
in church, so we don't have organs. As an accordionist, I think it's a pity that there are even no accordions. So, and then there was this classical tradition that started with big names like Glinka, Mikhail Glinka, and etc. Then there was also a point of identification with a group of composers, and most probably famous of them is Mussorgsky. There's Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and the rest of the group, who tried to identify themselves as Russian composers. They were kind of new Russian music, because they were working how would I say? So they were opposed to what happened at the time at the conservatory, because the oldest conservatory in St. Petersburg, when it was founded, it just copied all the Western standards. So, and also the teachers that they had back then in 19th century, they were nearly all foreigners. So really had a lot of foreign influence, which is also somehow marked the Russian history and the development of Russian music also in the future, because we are, I believe that's still very much related to German musicology, for example. So we still use a lot of German forms, German approach to it. Also are related with German philosophy, I think, German and French philosophy. So in this sense, Russia is somehow following the Europeans' tradition, but of course in its own way.
Yeah, foreign influence.
Yeah,
I didn't want to. Foreign influence. This is an important point. You know, another characteristic of music in multilingual Switzerland is that external influences overcame the internal language barriers. Thanks to external influences, in as far as I can see, internal barriers could be broken. Switzerland consists of 4 language regions. We have the German-speaking part, we have the French-speaking part, we have the Italian-speaking part, Ticino, and we have Graubünden. And thus, the individual regions of Switzerland were engaged thanks to external influences but not only in a diverse and fruitful exchange with each other, as well as with the foreign music centers. And I just had a look in some books which I kept from my time as artistic director in Lausanne from the Schweizerischer Tonkünstlerverein. And the internal Swiss exchange took place from 1900 onwards and was encouraged by a festival called Schweizerisches Tonkünstlerfest. And this was kind of a platform one time per year where you could listen to the most recent tendencies in modern music. And they invited artists from abroad. For example, for the first or second festival, Eugène Ysaÿe was invited, the violinist, just to give an example. And then we talked about Stravinsky just at the beginning. Then there was an organization called International Society for New Music, which, if I remember correctly, already had a Swiss sub-association in the 1920s. And if we make a step forward in history, then we have in the 60s, Pierre Boulez, who taught conducting and composition at the Music Academy in Basel. And one of his students, to name but one, was Heinz Holliger. Yeah. So this kind of exchange with abroad was always very important. And then Swiss composers, for sure, went to the centers of the avant-garde, first and foremost Darmstadt, the summer courses, but later in the 70s, to IRCAM in Paris, the research center founded by Pierre Boulez as part of the Centre Pompidou. And, in the same time, well, there was this orientation towards other countries, other centers of music, such as Darmstadt, Paris, and others. And on the other hand, it has to be said that Switzerland has a reputation as a late bloomer. I mean, if you remember the styles that were popular in the 50s and 60s, I mean, with a few exceptions, neoclassicism still prevailed in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And if you compare that to the styles abroad, well, this is quite
I just want to come a bit back to what you just said. you were talking about this exchange and exchange of influences that Switzerland have with their neighbors. And generally, I think that if we can generalize, talking about Switzerland, so this is one of particular features that Swiss culture is surrounded by huge neighbors. I mean, huge cultural heritage, like this German heritage, Italian, French. And the Swissness, Swissness is somehow there is a lot of connections with all these cultures. There's a lot of influences that people who were, I mean, today it's natural, but even 50 years ago and 100 years ago, basically it was already possible, and there were a lot of people who were traveling constantly between Paris and Geneva, and Montreux, between Zurich and Freiburg, etc., etc. So there was always an exchange, and I just wanted to follow a bit this topic that's Horger studied with Pierre Boulez, and then there was Klaus Huber, and I think with Klaus Huber's there were a few generations of composers who studied with Klaus Huber, be it in Switzerland, be it in Germany, I mean in Freiburg, be it somewhere else. And also Heinz Horger and many other people. I don't want to even try to list them all because that would be kind of unfair. I would forget half of them. But what I wanted to ask you your opinion about is, you know, that before there were a lot of Swiss actors who worked either in Switzerland or abroad as teacher. I mean, in the neighboring countries. So there was a lot of Swiss coming to teach in Freiburg there, and vice versa, and the other way around.
Yeah.
But also there were a lot of students at the later stage who were coming to Switzerland, because already in Basel there was Paul Sacher Stiftung, Foundation Paul Sacher. Also in Zurich, you know, Collegium Novum Zürich is not just Collegium Novum Zürich, it's Novum in relation to, but maybe you will talk about this later. But, yeah, exactly. So there were many things that were organized to support emergent composers, or emergent back at that time, back in 20th century, and to promote the values that were so important after the Second World War. So, and in Switzerland, we know that it was a neutral country, and somehow it put a really fruitful place to accumulate these ideas and to develop them further on. So my question would be, what do you think today? Is it still like this? Because I know that Switzerland is extremely international, and I know that there are a lot of foreign students. I also know that there are a lot of musicians coming from abroad, but I want to hear your opinion. So what do you think is the reason that they're coming there? Because I know that education is basically free, but you know, the cost of living are pretty high. And for example, you can also get a good education in Germany, you can get a good education in France. And why do you think Switzerland is still such an attractive place for people who are coming to study music? And I mean, who are coming to study contemporary music?
Wow. Well, I don't feel very competent to give a good answer to that question, but we could perhaps have a more detailed look on the scene of on the Swiss conservatories. And in my opinion, or my impression, is that in general, contemporary music in Swiss conservatories, academies, is a very important part of education across all fields, whether in pedagogy, in research, or in performance. You know, apart from that, every conservatory has its specificities, but I think this is a general, a very important aspect of Switzerland's conservatories, as far as I can see it. And apart from that, I think historically it was always the case, and it's not. We can't take the Swiss, the contemporary music. We should not isolate contemporary music from all the other fields. This is a general phenomenon. I mean, for the instrumental studies and for everything, that that there are so many foreign students in Switzerland, and we should not look at the contemporary music in an isolated manner. Well, if we think of a musician's career, then you start with the music academies. I mean, if we talk about contemporary music, you know, as I said, I don't want to say too much about that because I don't feel called to do so. But above all, Willy Fussen, I guess, said so many exciting things in the interview with, I think it was with Miroslava, and it's really worth listening to it in its entirety. And I think it's a source of inspiration for people who are thinking about how they can perhaps improve things in their own institution, whether it's in Switzerland or abroad. And yeah, but it's, for me, it's, I have to be, well, I don't know how to give you a convincing answer to you.
Yeah, basically, you gave an answer, so thank you. I mean, for me, your opinion was quite clear. I don't know, and yeah, Ule did a great job in Basel, that's for sure, and he also, you know, he managed to do some reforms, but in a very positive and a very enriching sense. So without ruining whatever, but just by complementing with things and by developing new formats of teaching, new formats of education, and new formats of knowledge transmission, which is extremely important. And I know that also, for example, there are musicians who are coming, young musicians who are coming to play with the Collegium Novum. I mean, also as a permanent members, but also as guests. And I mean, that Collegium Novum is a very open organism, if I can say so, because this is a living organism for me. I had the pleasure to play quite a lot with a group, and this, of course, musically and personally, that was always one of the best experiences that I had. But also, I know that there are many local people. I mean, local, they can be coming from whichever country, but let's say that they're local, Swiss-based musicians who are coming to play with the ensemble. Some of them were just recent students. Some of them might even doing some work affiliated with the academies or research work. So there are lots of people. I know that for our generation, probably that's a bit strange to reflect on what I want to reflect upon, but maybe still, what do you think has changed when those people are coming? What do you feel as a curator, as an artistic director? Because obviously you also, when you work out a strategy, you also somehow get inspired by those new ideas, new approaches, even if those people are not permanent members of the group. So what do you think? Is there something general that you could say, okay, this has changed? These people who are coming to play with us, these people who are joining Collegium Novum, they were taught in slightly different manner that, for example, I was taught, or that my generation was taught. Do you think there are any?
I keep it as almost as a rhetorical question, in the sense that I would say, well, it's quite simple. You know, you are talking about students, or even not students, but young musicians who just have their diploma. And it's true, we invite them regularly as substitutes, but they are not, most of them are not permanent members. We have, since you mentioned the Collegium Novum Zürich, we have 25 permanent ensemble musicians, permanent members. They are part of the association. And then we have the substitutes. And what's so, I'm always impressed by the way how these substitutes, and yes, most of them are coming from the conservatories, how they integrate themselves in the existing Klangkörper, as we say in German, in the existing organism. This is a very nice word in German, Klangkörper, but I don't know if we can translate it into English. I don't think that
sonic organism. I don't know if it makes sense. Yeah.
They really integrate themselves on the one hand, and on the other hand, they bring a certain flexibility.
Okay.
The way of working gets more versatile, in my opinion. but this is more, this happens more on the mentality, I think, and less in the result. And I mean, this makes the quality of an ensemble, the integration, or how can I say it? If you want to achieve something that is big in general in life, if you want to achieve something that is bigger than yourself, then you have to join together with others, and this makes an ensemble.
That's fantastic.
You have to integrate, and this is what I try to cultivate a bit more as an artistic director. Well, it's difficult, but this is all about individuals who pool their abilities, their influence, and their resources in order to pursue overarching goals. That's all. It's simple to say and difficult to achieve.
Yeah, right. So these are individuals who come in with their own personalities, who join together and they make an ensemble. Because ensemble, I just remind that ensemble, and in French, for example, it means literally together. So
right.
This is ensemble, being together.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that that's very true for example, for Collegium Novum, because this is a group which a very rich history, and this is not easy actually being a collective with a rich history, because you always have to reflect upon your own tradition as a group, and you always have to think, what do you do with this tradition? Because of course there are many ways, and the easiest way and probably the most boring one would be just to follow this tradition automatically without paying attention that tradition should be developed, that tradition is a living tradition.
Right.
And if you just automatically would do the music that has been done, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, you could invite the same people, you could invite, I don't know, you could just try to restore the same atmosphere, and it would be kind of very strange because it wouldn't work. I mean, on artistic level, it wouldn't work. On personal level, it wouldn't work, because even if those people would join the group again. I mean, of course, I know that there in Collegium Novum, there are people who used to play then, who were with the group from the very beginning, and they're fantastic musicians. I don't mean that. I mean, that's people who were with a group and who left for some reasons, or just the same composers, the same conductors, the same, not like long year collaborators, but just trying to keep everything as it used to be, which probably doesn't work today. But that would be the easiest way. It wouldn't last long though, but for a few years, for a few seasons, it could be easy. Then another approach, probably totally different, is just to start everything new, which is also interesting because, again, in regard to tradition, what do you do with tradition? Okay, you can just say, no, that there's a bad tradition, we will do new tradition, we will do everything new. Then my question would be, okay, why do we need then Collegium Novum, or I don't know, Contre-Champ or Ensemble Contemporain? So why not just a new ensemble? Yeah, that would be my question. And the third way, and I think that's the way the Collegium Novum been developed in the last years, and also before, because I admire absolutely the work of your predecessor, of Johannes, of Jens Schubbe, who was artistic director of Collegium Novum before Johannes Knapp, and who was doing a great job developing this. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
In the Russian scene and Eastern contemporary music in general. And a large knowledge. Well, so many questions, Sergej.
That was not a question; they were just reflection. I'm sorry.
But we are talking so much about Switzerland.
You can ask me the same question.
Well, right. Tell us something about about Russian. It has been a long day, and it's had in the evening is a bit. Tell us something about Russian ensembles, and to ask you a concrete question: do you think contemporary music ensembles are a phenomenon of big cities, or do you consider it? I mean, can you create an ensemble of contemporary music anywhere in the world, whether it's a big city or a village?
That's a very good point, actually. That you mentioned, because especially today with the pandemic, with all these restrictions, with travel restrictions, I think it gives us something to think about. Because before, I mean, if you would ask me the same question 30 years ago, well, 30 years ago I probably wouldn't answer anything, but theoretically, that would be clear that, of course, there are big centers of 40 years ago, let's say. Yeah, there is still Paris and Moscow and whatever.
Yeah.
And I would say that it's quite logical that the people would be attracted by those big cities, and then they form ensembles in those big cities, because they're also infrastructure, and there's lots of audience and lots of possibilities for presenting themselves. But today, I think it's changing, because, well, it's changing everywhere. I will try to answer your question about the situation in Russia, because it's different. But just my thoughts about the general situation in the world wherever we are, specifically, by the way, in Switzerland, that really the people in small places start to form new groups, and they do not pretend to be, to be a great institution, because the young generation, they have another, well, not another, kind of more advanced than mine, let's say, thinking. They are able to think without any institutionalized patterns. I mean, me too. I hope that I'm able to think without institutionalized patterns, but I had to learn this intentionally. And the young generation, the emerging generation of musicians, I think it just comes naturally, that they're kind of free. And surprisingly, I think this is also the case in Russia. I mean, being free in today's Russia is a kind of really strange phrase. I mean, it's easy to say when I'm in Norway, but yeah, of course, this quite a problematic situation today in Russia. I mean, politically and also with regard to society. But I know also that there are lots of musicians who are trying to find their way with the institution. And there are several reasons for this. This is, of course, the power relations, which are universal, so it doesn't concern uniquely Russia. Power relations are a big theme, and personally for me, this is a very interesting topic because, for example, recently I had a talk and I criticized the notion of artistic director, of curator itself. I was so the angle that was taken, the perspective, my perspective was that curating music means this responsibility, of course, and you can be as open and as you are, and you can promote diversity, you can promote underrepresented artists, but still you're acting. I don't mean you, I mean generally. You're acting as someone who is empowered by a professional community. And if we look into the actors that form this professional community, then once again we will come to the white males, European. This is basically the story. So anyway, this is a general problem, not just Russian, but in Russia, there are a young generation of people who are trying to find their way with the institution, and some of them, they become, in the best sense, institutionalized. Some of them, they become also institutionalized in the worst sense, because there are lots of institutions in Russia. Some of them kind of on the paper that they do something to promote contemporary music, but in practice, contemporary means really contemporary with the time. And the times in Russia are strange. So somehow contemporary music reflects what happens in the society. And in a sense, also in Russia, it reflects what happens in society. And the problem is, of course, the education, because it's not as open as in Switzerland, for example. Yes, I can compare because I studied in Russia, but I also worked I was guest teaching, but still I know how Swiss education system works. So, and basically, there are a few centers that still attract people from all over the country. And Russia is huge, and this is also there are also some historical reasons for this. That Russia is a very centralized country.
Yeah.
So whatever happens happens in Moscow and St. Petersburg and some other centers. So this is quite impossible to imagine that there is a small distant village in Siberia and there are people who say, okay, let's do contemporary music.
Yeah.
Maybe it exists, I just don't know. But for me, I really cannot imagine. But on the other hand, I know that there are people who are coming from those distant places, but they're coming first from their village to the nearest center.
Yeah.
Then from this nearest center, they're coming to even bigger city. Then from the big city, they're coming to Petersburg or Moscow.
Yeah.
Because in Moscow, at least, there's a department of contemporary music. There is Studio of New Music, the group that I worked with for many years, and Center for Contemporary Music. So there's a kind of structurized approach to contemporary music. And I think that the center, the ensemble, and the department are open-minded enough to let basically all the plants grow.
Yeah.
I mean it. But on the other hand, the conservatory in general is really conservative. Yeah, and it's also I'm not biased against conservatory. I don't want to say it's bad or it's good. It's good. But this is Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory. That means that, again, speaking about traditions, then you have to cope with these traditions. You have to find your own approach to this tradition. And the tradition is huge, responsibility is huge, and institution is huge. And of course, there are many people who are just coming there and they do not want to do anything with contemporary music. And it's very difficult to find approach to those people. So this is probably the problem. And also there is an institutional problem. There is a big problem of support because that probably you can guess that Russian authorities, they do not support that much independent contemporary music. And by saying independent, I mean not only this freie Szene, but I mean just general music which is not politically motivated, so to say. So there's quite problematic. But what's I remember your question, sorry.
But, the center of the answer was, I think that Russia is a centralized country.
I just wanted to say that with regard to pandemic, this is very interesting because I think that those processes, they're unstoppable wherever. And with the development of internet, with the development of telematic composition, because that their research, for example, in ZHD and University of Art in Zurich, they've been a research project that's dedicated to the creative possibilities of doing music online. I mean, we also, Studio for New Music, they have another project that also explored possibility of creative collaboration online. So last year, we invited Sergej Tchirkov and Anna Chmuki. We invited for a collective collaborative project. There were no musicians, there were no composers, there were just participants. And I call this, because I was the author of the project, so I call this peer-to-peer. Yeah, all the peers. We just had two guest peers, Sergej and Anna Chmuki, and they developed something. And there were a lot of embarrassing situations, like we were all online, so everything was streamed online, was live, and there was a lot of embarrassing situations, a lot of pauses. So I was kind of moderator, but I was not supposed, to keep tension. And it was such a natural thing. At some point, I realized that okay, we are just here, we are separated by the screen, but let's take a pause. We have right to do this. We do not have to deliver, a lecture. This is now part of our everyday life. And I think somehow this way of thinking influenced very much also what happens with regard to those new ensembles, that really 2 people, 3 people can come together in small village. Then they can decide, okay, we need someone else. And this someone else lives 1,000 kilometers away. So he can live in Australia. Let's make contact with him or with her.
Yeah.
And that gives me a lot of hope also in regard of the topic that I just raised, with regard to diversity, with regard to cultural exchange. And when I'm talking about cultural exchange, I mean not only exchange between, let's say, Russia and Switzerland, which is extremely good too, but between Western culture and non-Western culture, which is also a generalization of what does mean non-Western. There are huge amount of traditions. So on this, I think that internet and the digital technology, they make it all possible, and I'm happy that it's doable somehow.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sorry, but that was basically one of my, not questions, but one of my points that I wanted also to talk with you about the tendencies, about some something that might happen in the nearest future or in not so nearest future. So because obviously as artistic director you have a clear artistic vision, and obviously you're thinking ahead, not just the next season or even not the next 5 years. But so what do you think, how would you picture what's to expect, and what could be potentially the role of your group of Collegium Novum in this process? So
Yeah.
how do you see the whole thing?
Well, that's a big picture question. For me, it's difficult to predict the future. Future is unknown. But I'd like to formulate some visions, perhaps. I mean, generally speaking, the arts are moving closer and closer together, isn't it? And so my aim is to create conditions at the level of organization, and now I'm talking as an administrator. I'm not a musician anymore. I mean, I studied cello, and this instrument is still very important for me, but not in my professional life. So what I want to say, my only real profession is to be an administrator. In the noble sense, I have to organize things and create conditions so that a musician can work in the best manner. At the level of organization, it is important to bring together different mentalities and ways of functioning. Problem is, let's take Zurich as an example. There are the big institutions in dance, theater, and so on, and they have other planning periods than the Collegium Novum. They are so different that it's difficult to really keep in touch. And this is a very primitive or basic problem, but difficult to overcome. I don't know how it is in other cities, but in Zurich it's a very big problem. I'm a lot in exchange with other institutions. Well, this is again a problem of institutionalization. Sorry, because there's also the freie Szene, the independent scene, but this is nevertheless a real challenge. Then, generally speaking, I would say the spatial conditions must be improved. So I would say I'm dreaming of rooms, I'm dreaming of venues.
Yeah.
And the contemporary music scene often works under precarious spatial conditions. And what I try to explain to politicians is that a space it's not just a space, but it is like the extension of the instrument, of the body. A good space, a good room to rehearse and to perform is essential in order to improve the profile of an ensemble and the Klangbild, as we say in German, sound, just simply. This is another important aspect that comes into my mind now that you are asking this difficult question. Now I'm thinking about the third aspect. Export abroad internationally works very well. I mean, this thanks to various support programs, including financial help by Provincia, for example. But exchange within Switzerland is still very difficult. And now I'm talking about again about Swiss specificities. Would be interesting to listen to you how it is in Russia. To put it somewhat simply, it is easier to organize concerts abroad than to organize a tour at home.
Yeah, and probably it's also cheaper.
Yeah. Well, it depends. Yeah. And if the organization succeeds, and there are good examples. For example, Contrechamp had a total series of concerts in the Gare du Nord. So Contrechamp from Geneva moves to Basel, the northern part, next to the French and German border. This is a good example, but it is difficult to find a large audience there. because each ensemble, each institution, each whatever, each group, each collective has its own audience, but it's difficult to how to say it, to make people that don't know your ensemble in another city curious about what you are doing. Well, to summarize it, there's still a lot to do. You know, very generally speaking, the current conditions are so incredibly tough, especially with the pandemic now. And I hope, and this is really something that keeps me alive, I hope that together we will succeed in mobilizing our thinking, well, how to say, thinking in possibilities, you know, thinking in utopias. So to help ourselves to get over reality, or rather to give it a shape, to give reality a shape in a self-determined manner. This is very, I mean, this sounds like a Sunday speech, but
there was a song, there was a song, "Dreams Are My Reality." So this let's dream, let's think big. And actually, I know that the problem that still exists in Switzerland, and I just wanted to ask you that you mentioned that it's extremely difficult for a group, let's say from Zurich, to be accepted, even in Basel, or maybe specifically in Basel. So, do you think that those cantonal, how to say, borders, I mean, cultural, mental borders, that they are still exist and they are still that strong? Because I remember when actually we first met, but it was in 2017. You were then responsible for organization of Association des Musiciens Suisses meeting in Geneva, and it was part of Archipel Festival.
Yeah.
And I remember that there was a concert, I think it was this edition that year in 17. There was a concert of Collegium Novum. I didn't play the concert, I had another project at the same festival. But Collegium Novum came, and normally festival events are well attended, but then there were, I don't know, maybe a few people in the hall.
Yeah.
And the program was wonderful. The musicians were wonderful. The festival is great. The audience in Geneva is, well, it's not an easy audience, but it's very attentive audience, so that people who know what they want to hear. And I was so surprised that there were so few people in the hall. And the next day, I've been talking to a colleague of mine who's Geneva based, and he told me that it's quite natural because this Collegium Novum Zürich, because also Contrechamp they also played, and they also played great concert, and the program was great, and but the hall was more or less full. And you know, and I thought, well, this is a festival of contemporary music. This is a kind of niche festival. So all the audience, nearly all the people who were coming to this festival, they were kind of connoisseurs. So they were not just people from the streets, unfortunately. But back at that time in 2017, it was still the case. So now, by the way, probably something's changing in this aspect. But still, those people, they came to listen to Contrechamp, and they wouldn't come to listen to Collegium Novum Zurich. And probably that, I don't know if it would be the case also in Zurich, probably not. But still, I thought that's just because, you know, this mental borders.
I'm not sure if it's, you could see it also in a very positive way. I mean, there's a strong identification with the ensemble of your own town, where you're living. Well, I have no final explanation for that phenomenon. For me, it's just very strange. You know, I'm German. I came to Switzerland in 2013, and I started working in a Swiss Romande in Lausanne, and not in the German part, German-speaking part. And so for me, there's yes, the barriers exist. I can feel that almost every day. I'm, you know, perhaps that until right now, I was also managing director of the Nikati competition. And if we are talking about important institutions and important organizations in Switzerland in the field of contemporary music, then we should at least mention it.
That's true.
I mean, it's I always felt that in the discussions, it's difficult to general, well, to say what it is for me, but it's very present, these cultural differences. It is, if I remember now, the projects that have been sent during the application process to the jury in 2019, in spring 2019, I felt that is already on an artistic level, a difference regarding the ideas. For example, well, we had a new category intended for various innovative musical and sound-based approaches. Sorry. And open to association with other art forms, with other forms of artistic expression. And so we invited them to present performative projects that differ a lot from the classical concert format, as admitted in the traditional category called interpretation. And I had the impression that you really can see a border between those from the French part and those from the German-speaking part. But we should take care, because in the same times there are a lot of collaborations. There were groups with the students from both parts, and there are also students who start to study in Geneva and then they come to Bern, or the other way around. So I always try to avoid such kind of generalizations, but we try to give an overview tonight. Well, an overview.
I meant, I didn't say that it's necessarily negative. I just wanted to develop your remark that it's very difficult to organize something in Switzerland. I mean, for let's say for Collegium Novum, it's difficult to organize something, especially something permanent in another canton. Well, maybe actually with a permanent, with a long-term project, it's a bit easy. It's difficult, of course, to find funding and to find resources to start the whole thing. But since you start, it takes time. But then, like this is the case now with the Contre-Chambre and Gardeno, that the people would know that there is a tradition, that it exists, that it's not just they came, play, and then they gone. I think that Switzerland in general, it's, again, I generalize, but I can afford this, I'm a foreigner. So I think that Switzerland in general, they're very much long-term oriented. So they can think big, and they can be specific in a very, very distant perspective. So I think that's also interesting. It's an interesting quality, and probably also something to work with.
Before you ask me a question about the future, what is your biggest wish for the contemporary music scene in Russia in general? What is your vision, or what is your what are you longing for? As an artist, as an accordion player, and so on. Is there? I mean, that might be something, no?
This is a good question, and I have to, now it's my turn to confess that I'm not competent at all to answer this, because of course I've been doing projects in Russia, but as artistic manager, that's fine. I mean, I could, of course, take into account some specific situations, and I can make projection on the audience reaction. But again, it depends whether this is Moscow Conservatory, and that's one thing. When this is a kind of freie scene, the independent scene, then it's another story. But as a musician myself, as an accordion, as a performer, I cannot say that I ever in my career have been somehow that much rooted in Russia. So I always was quite international. And because probably the last 10 years I played in Switzerland, maybe more than in Russia. So this is partly the answer. I know that it's not just my own feeling about this. So I can make a few projections or predictions. I don't know. Of course, it depends, as everywhere. It depends to a large extent on the political situation. And because right now there is a kind of so you just cannot be, okay, I'm a musician, and I just doing music. So this position, this attitude doesn't work anymore. You cannot just stay neutral. It's extremely difficult. And for people who are institutionalized, that's double as difficult, because if you just want to do your work and you don't want to be politically biased, then it's very, very difficult to avoid this, the pressure that is put from the one side, it's put from the authorities, from the other side, it's put by the people who are kind of independent. Let's say a lot of Russian living abroad, they said, okay, but how can you work in such conditions? This is one thing. But I know that there are lots of professionals, I mean, not necessarily musicians, just lots of professionals who are really just honest people, and they're doing a wonderful job. And thanks to people like those professionals, Russia somehow survived all these revolutions and things like that, because there were always people who cared about the heritage, about the tradition, about developing this tradition, about the future. So I mean, and this is not an easy thing. Let's just mention the revolution, which happens more than 100 years ago, when everything was just destroyed, just suddenly. And many Russian artists, many composers, by the way, were forced to leave the country. And Stravinsky, one of them, he left before, but still. And then in 20s, there are many prominent Russian thinkers who were forced also to flee, and lots of inventors, actually. They also engineers and people who made a lot of discoveries, like microtonal music. One of those discoveries made by Ivan Vishnegradsky. This is a quarter-tone piano. He's Russian. And the theremin works, the instrument, like you play with the waves with your hand. It was developed by Lev Theremin, who is also of Russian origin. So unfortunately that happens, and the history kind of circles and it repeats itself. So that happens. I hope that it's going to be somehow smoother than it used to be in Russian history, the transition. But of course, it very much depends on political situation. But otherwise, I think that it's quite globalized. So the whole situation is globalized, and Russia is very much internet addicted. So I think that there's the whole generation of people who can just find whatever they want on the internet, and they are quite good informed. So I think that general thing is, to learn how to find your way in this huge amount of information. And this is true not only for Russia, it's true for every country, for every society, because we have really informational overload. And we have also fake news. This is a wonderful phenomena, fake news. So what does it mean to have this as a part of our everyday life, fake news and over information? So I think this is basically the main challenge, how to find your way in all this over informated over-informed world. This is also one of the points that I think a musician, an artist should make clear for herself or for himself, because either if I want to develop something, I want to know in which direction shall I develop this. The same is true for ensemble. So I think that's also, now there's a kind of there's a fashion of this small quasi-independent ensembles, which is quite a normal process, and I support it, and I think that's wonderful. But I think that the future probably will be also somehow marked by this transatlantic, so to say, by the international cooperations. And not because I want to do a project with the United States, or I want to do the project with Switzerland, but because of cultural necessity. And here I'm thinking, again, I repeat myself, but I'm thinking about the culture that has been underrepresented so far. Because even now, when we learn a lot of different cultures, we still have this, world music. What does it mean, world music? Where is this world music? I mean, come on, we are all world, we are all humans. So something like that. So, and because that's also my personal problem, because I have a lot of interest towards other cultures, but I don't have sufficient knowledges. Not as a musician, not as just a listener. So I mean, let's have a look at I don't know, Indian musicology. This is fantastic. They were great thinkers, and I even not able to mention any single name without checking my notes.
Well,
And this is a
our
problem.
Eurocentristic way of doing programs would be another issue that we could talk about, but
Yeah,
we need hours and hours.
Before we finish, Johannes, there's one question I actually wanted to ask you from the very beginning.
Tell me.
Don't be afraid.
About Switzerland, but yeah, if you want to ask me.
Yeah. You mentioned, that you were involved in a lot of activities, that you also did a lot of administrative work. And I think you mentioned already Nikati competition and Association of Swiss Musicians, but also you were somehow involved into the creation of this pact of Ensemble pour Trompette. Yeah. And before you were doing things for Salzburg Biennale, and you were working for Le Jardin Musicaux, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So,
that's very well informed.
Right. In addition to all this, of course, there was different levels of responsibility in all these positions, but still. And you're also independent writer on contemporary music. And I know your articles, and I read you a lot of Dissonance and other papers, and they're brilliant. And just that. But my question would be the following. So, because now you're general manager, but first you're artistic director for Collegium Novum. And so, how do all those administrative experiences that you gained through your life, how do those administrative experiences influence or affect your current vision as artistic director? So how do they contribute? How do they form your artistic vision?
Well, I never thought about this because I'm totally in it. And it's not very often that I reflect my own work, or myself in all that. I always see a certain challenge, a certain problem, whatever, a certain task to accomplish. And now, I would say it's very important to have a general vision. And, before I came to Collegium, I was union secretary, something that you didn't mention because it seems to be so far from everything I did before and afterwards. But no, I would say it's part of that. The question of the fees of the musician is an important thing. And I'm active in music management for 8 years now, and I'm very glad about having all these different experiences, even if they have been, even I made them sometimes in a very short time. For example, it was only 13 or 14 months that I have been a union secretary for the Schweizerischer Musikerverband in Zurich. Mm-hmm. But it gave me, or thanks to all that, I have a kind of a background or a certain basis where I can look at all these different aspects in the same time. Sometimes I say to myself, well, it would be better if I'm only in the arts. And if I see my work or I see my main tasks in the field of curating, then I would be a bit more naive, perhaps sometimes a bit more ambitious even, mm-hmm. But I think in the same time less realistic. And a kind of pragmatism is very important. My vision for myself, or what I want to obtain, is to really marry the vision on the one hand and a kind of almost brutal pragmatism on the other, and to bring that together. Fantastic. And without all these different experiences, I wouldn't think like that.
Well, good, perfect answer. Perfect answer. Thank you,
Sergej. I have a last question to you too. As I said before, you are a border crosser. Well, how do you perceive, just in some sentences, the differences of the contemporary music scenes in Russia and in Switzerland. Will you be able to take a step backward and to say something very general about that? We are talking about culture, and what is the essence? What do you feel? Perhaps it can be a very subjective answer. What do you feel if you're working in Russia, and what do you feel when you're working in Switzerland? What is the it's a general question, but perhaps you have a
this is uneasy. This is not an easy question. I mean, just because it requires a kind of generalized answer. I will try. So first, this is an attention to all the details, which is quite peculiar for my experiences in Russia, in Switzerland. Sorry. Starting from the being punctual, ending up with the tiniest detail, the attention to smallest details. This is something which exists in Switzerland, and this is something which is not automatically meant in Russia. So you see what I mean, yeah? So it's not that Russians are necessarily unpunctual or something like that. It's just that things like this, it can happen, let's say in Moscow, that a musician would come 10, 15, 20 minutes later to rehearsal because he's stuck in a traffic jam or somewhere else, because Moscow is a huge city. Mm. So, but still, they could seem to be just organizational problems, but for me, they are not. So my really subjective feeling is that out of those small details, there is a big picture. And this is not a question of my comfort as a performer. So that, let's say, it's much more comfortable to play with Spitz musicians. I cannot say this because the terms of being comfortable or uncomfortable is not a question for me. So I cannot talk about music in terms of comfort or discomfort. But it's just this attention to the small details, which is important, and somehow it exists in Switzerland, basically everywhere. So I think I can generalize here. Of course, there are super professional groups, like Collegium Novum Zürich, or many others, and there are maybe just emerging groups. But this attention to detail, it will be there. And what is even more interesting, maybe from the point of view of those emergent ensembles, this attention to detail will give yet another perspective, which is also fascinating. So this is first a big distinction for me. And also in Russia, I can feel that it's really centralized. So I can feel it. I know that if in Switzerland I would take a train and go from Zurich to Basel, from Basel to, I don't know, somewhere else, from somewhere else to Uri, if I would ask an Uri about contemporary music, probably they wouldn't just understand me. I don't know, but
that's true. That's an important point. Just to interrupt you for some seconds. I mean, we have a contemporary music ensemble in Chur, in Graubünden, the capital of the canton of Graubünden, and we have a contemporary music ensemble in La Chaux-de-Fonds. La Chaux-de-Fonds is a city at 1,000 meters above sea level, and it is also one of the highest cities in Europe, even. So, well, there you see, and I'm talking about the Nouvel Ensemble Contemporain, Le NEC. This is quite special about Switzerland. This is perhaps one of the biggest differences between these two countries. Well, a kind of common characteristic between Russia and Switzerland is probably the fact that, well, I only can talk about Switzerland, as I said at the beginning, since I have never been in Russia, but Switzerland has always been a place for encounter, a space, I would say, for friction too. We talked about the different linguistic regions, and a space for terrain, for confrontation between different cultures in itself. I think this is, to put it in one sentence, could be a kind of description of contemporary music in Switzerland, even though it's very general, and perhaps we could apply to the visual arts too. I don't know, but
no. I think that's interesting. I just was thinking while you were first when you were asking me, and then as you also shared your thoughts. And I thought that partly both of us, we already gave our opinion when we presented this list of participants of Stravinsky Dialogue. And just for our audience, I probably must explain a bit that, of course, this list is not extensive. And the participants that we choose, both of us, we had different criteria, and it was not a competition. There was not an open call. My point of view was just I wanted the Russian audience to learn new names, maybe, and to learn something from the people who already contributed a lot to form in those new situation in Switzerland, and as well to learn just new names, emerging composers. I mean, emergent for Russians, not that they're emergent. Yeah. So, and that was one of my practical and very pragmatic aspects when I put those names together. And of course, I was also looking for possibly different artistic approach and formats and different backgrounds. So I tried to include artists who moved to Switzerland. Yeah, so not just necessarily ethnically Swiss, because it will be quite strange. And also, I think both of us, we wanted to keep kind of representative selection according to cantons, gender, age, whatever, specializations, so composer, musicologist, and like Johannes said, media artist, researcher, performance, etc. And then, of course, the team of Stravinsky.Online, they made a lot of amendments because, it was just our suggestion. We never had any consultations with those people before. So it was just, okay, yeah, you may talk with this. It might be interesting. So basically, that's what Johannes and I did. I mean, to put it roughly. Of course, there was a lot of reflection, but it looked like that. But of course, then the team, they had to do their practical work. They had to find contacts. They had to make appointments for those interviews. There's a lot of work behind the project that is not obvious even to us. So, and of course, there were some amendments, and I think that partly I explained our shared responsibility. And yet another thing, we never discussed our list, so we just put our list separately. I had my own list of names, Johannes had his own list of names, then we put them together, and then the team of Stravinsky.Online, they just selected those who were on both lists, they were automatically selected, and those who were not on the list, then we discuss this at a later stage. So that was.
I'm not sure if all the protagonists who have been on both lists have been selected and the other way around, but this is just a few exceptions. In general,
the general approach was.
Sergej, what I realized when I saw our lists, today the so-called portfolio existence is the common profile. Just have a look at the composers and the creators, to put it more generally. I think they're, those who have dedicated themselves solely to composing can be counted on less than two hands. I'm talking about Switzerland now. And none of those personalities we have had already in the talks so far is exclusively a composer.
Right.
But a lot of interpreters, musicians are composers too. And today you read the so-called portfolio existence. I don't know if you say it in English, but in German, portfolio Karriere, portfolio Laufbahn is really the common profile. But in the same time, such generalizations are not that interesting. It is much more interesting to dedicate oneself to the work of a composer, to observe him over the years and to really kind of accompany him. And then you come to the real sense of curating. It's to take care of something, taking care. Yeah. And taking care is not only in an artistic manner. It's also it's also about social security. It is about the working conditions. And that's what I said before. It's quite important. Perhaps some ensemble members are listening to what I'm saying now, and they have already so many things to criticize, I'm sure. But as a kind of goal, I fixed it 2 years ago when I started working for the Collegium Novum Zürich, and this is our responsibility. Curating is not about just putting some names together, and even not about choosing venues and so on, but really about caring as much as you can, and especially in these times.
Yeah, about well-being of the ensemble. Yeah, I think that's actually a good point, a good conclusion. Taking care.
Oh yes, if I look. Oh yeah, I'm looking at the time. Well,
but it was nice. It is nice to talk to you, and I think there were quite a lot of topics that were maybe general, maybe obvious, but still interesting and still relevant. And I hope that it could be of some interest for those who are following us.
I hope too. We had a lot of aspects, and it's difficult to find a good way through all that. And I already know so many things that we should have said too, but that's life, and that's this format too.
Then it's live. Then I said thank you so much, Johannes. Thank you, Stravinsky.Online, for inviting us. And thank you, Pro Helvetia, for supporting this, I think, wonderful exchange project, because it's really exchange. The possibility to talk is priceless. And
thank you, Sergej.
yes, thank you. Take care.
All the best to you all, and see you very soon on concert, I hope.
Sure.